There is a moment in many marriages, silent, heavy, and painfully familiar, when two people who once talked for hours can no longer find the courage to speak even a single honest sentence. A moment when the silence between them becomes louder than the conflict that caused it. A moment when they look at the person they promised forever to, the person who once felt like home, and suddenly feel like they are standing at opposite ends of a broken bridge. This silence is not born overnight. It arrives slowly, quietly, and often unnoticed. It starts with hurt. Then hurt turns into distance. Distance grows into resentment. And resentment becomes a wall, one brick at a time. Today, I want to explore why some couples stop communicating after conflict, but more importantly, how they can find their way back. Because behind every argument that ends in silence, there is a story, of fear, of pride, of misunderstanding, but also of love longing for repair. This is not just an explanation. This is a reminder that communication is not just about speaking. It is about courage, vulnerability, and connection, the very things marriage was built upon. 1. Silence after conflict isn't about lack of love, it's about self-protection. When two people stop communicating after a conflict, the world often assumes the love has faded. But in reality, silence often signals the opposite, that the love is still strong enough to hurt. People withdraw not because they don't care, but because they care so much that they fear the consequences of another emotional wound. Some stop talking because they fear rejection. Some fear judgment. Some fear escalating the argument. Some fear being misunderstood. And some fear that speaking their truth might break what's left of the marriage. In the quiet heart of every conflict lies one universal human emotion: fear. Fear of losing the person you love. Fear of losing the version of yourself you once were with them. And so silence becomes a shield. It is easier to pull away than to lean in. It is easier to avoid than to confront. It is easier to be quiet than to risk being hurt again. But the tragedy of this self-protection is that it protects nothing. It only postpones the pain until the silence grows so thick that neither partner knows how to break it anymore. 2. Many couples never learned how to have healthy conflict. Nobody teaches us how to fight with love. We learn how to walk, how to write, how to multiply, how to drive. But no one hands us a manual that says, here is how you argue without destroying each other. Here is how you express frustration without triggering defensiveness. Here is how to disagree without viewing your partner as the enemy. And so we enter marriage carrying the conflict habits we learned from childhood. Habits we absorbed silently, habits shaped by our family, our experiences, or our trauma. Maybe you grew up in a house where conflict meant yelling. Maybe your partner grew up in a home where conflict meant silence. And now each of you is triggered by the other's instinctive response. When you shout, they shut down. When they shut down, you feel unheard. When you feel unheard, you shout more. And on the cycle goes. Conflict becomes a battlefield rather than a bridge. But remember this: what you never learned can still be learned. What you never practiced can still be practiced. What was broken can still be rebuilt. 3. Pride makes silence feel safer than vulnerability. One of the most common reasons couples stop communicating after conflict is pride. Not arrogance, but the kind of pride that comes from old wounds. The kind that whispers, if I speak first, I lose. If I apologize, I look weak. I shouldn't have to explain myself, they should just understand. But pride is the enemy of intimacy. In marriage, silence is rarely strength. And speaking first is rarely defeat. Humility is not about lowering yourself. It is about lifting your relationship above the need to be right. Because at the end of the day, the question is not who started the argument, but rather, who will be brave enough to end the distance. Marriage is not a debate to be won. It is a partnership to be nurtured. Pride builds walls. Humility builds bridges. Only one of them leads you home. 4. Emotional exhaustion turns communication into a burden. There are moments when silence after conflict happens not because someone is angry, but because they are tired, emotionally drained, overwhelmed, running on empty. Sometimes a couple stops communicating because both partners feel they have given their all. Not just to the marriage, but to life. Stress, work, children, bills, responsibilities, trauma, loss, fatigue. When the outside world takes too much from a person, they often have nothing left to give inside their marriage. It becomes easier to shut down than to show up. Not because the marriage isn't important, but because the person feels depleted. Conflict requires energy. Healing requires energy. Communication requires energy. And when life drains that energy away, even the smallest conversation feels heavy. But emotional exhaustion is not a sign that a marriage is dying. It is a sign that the people in it need care, rest, and renewal. Because when two empty people try to pour into each other, silence becomes their default state. 5. Hurt turns into distance when pain is left unspoken. One of the most damaging things in marriage is unresolved hurt. Not the fight itself. Not the disagreement. Not even the harsh words spoken in the heat of the moment. It is the hurt that lingers after the argument is over. When someone's pain goes unacknowledged, it does not disappear. It simply retreats inward and forms a barrier between them and their partner. This hurt can be a harsh tone, a dismissive comment, a forgotten promise, a betrayal, a lack of appreciation, a moment of disrespect. Small or big, pain left unspoken becomes pain unhealed. And pain unhealed becomes distance. The truth is, people often stop communicating after conflict because their hearts feel unsafe. Because they believe that speaking their truth will only invite more hurt. And so silence becomes their way of protecting themselves from further emotional injury. But no marriage heals in the dark. Healing requires light. Healing requires honesty. Healing requires the courage to say, "This hurt me, and I want us to fix it together." 6. Communication breaks down when couples don't feel seen or understood. One of the deepest human desires is to feel understood. Not agreed with, not validated in every opinion, but understood. Many couples fall silent after conflict because they feel unheard. When one partner feels misunderstood, they push harder to explain. When the other person feels attacked, they pull away. One shouts to be seen. The other withdraws to feel safe. Both feel alone in the relationship. And over time, both decide that speaking leads nowhere. So silence becomes the default, because communication feels pointless. But imagine a different scenario. Imagine listening not to reply, but to understand. Imagine pausing not to defend yourself, but to empathize. Imagine making your partner feel seen even when you disagree. In that space, communication becomes a bridge again. Because the truth is, most couples don't stop communicating because they lost love. They stop communicating because they lost hope that the other person will hear them with compassion. 7. Conflict triggers past trauma, not just present emotions. Sometimes silence after conflict has nothing to do with the argument itself. It has to do with old wounds. Childhood trauma, past relationships, abandonment issues, emotional scars. When someone shuts down after conflict, it might not be their partner they are protecting themselves from. It might be their past. A raised voice might remind them of a home where anger meant danger. A cold tone might remind them of a parent who withheld affection. Disagreement might remind them of a relationship where conflict led to rejection. So they withdraw not because they don't care, but because their nervous system has learned that silence is safety. But the beautiful thing about marriage is that it can be the place where old wounds finally heal. If both partners are willing to understand, not judge, the emotional triggers each brings into the relationship. 8. Some couples mistakenly think silence equals peace. One of the most common misunderstandings in marriage is the belief that if you avoid the topic, you avoid the conflict. But silence does not resolve conflict. Silence stores conflict, like pressure building in a sealed container. Like a volcano holding back its eruption. Like a wound covered with a bandage but never treated. Silence may create temporary peace. But unspoken pain always resurfaces. Sometimes months or years later, stronger than before. True peace is not the absence of conversation. It is the presence of understanding. Avoidance is not harmony. Avoidance is postponement. And what is postponed is never healed. 9. Couples stop communicating when they forget they're on the same team. In marriage, conflict should feel like two people fighting the problem, not each other. But during arguments, partners often forget that they are allies, not opponents. They stop communicating because they feel they must defend themselves. But imagine a marriage where you could say, "I'm frustrated, but I'm still with you. I'm angry, but I'm not against you. We disagree, but we are still a team." Imagine what could be healed if conflict didn't feel like war. The truth is, many couples stop communicating after conflict because they see each other as adversaries. They forget that love isn't about winning. It's about understanding. It's about unity. It's about remembering that your partner is not the problem. The problem is the problem. 10. But silence doesn't have to be the end, it can be the turning point. Here is the hopeful truth. Silence does not mean your marriage is broken beyond repair. Silence means something in your marriage needs healing. And healing is always possible. Because silence is not the absence of love. It is the cry for better communication, deeper understanding, and renewed connection. This silence can become the moment you both decide to listen with empathy, to speak with honesty, to apologize with humility, to forgive with maturity, to rebuild with intention, to love with courage. How couples can break the silence and reconnect. Here is the bridge back to each other. 1. Speak with vulnerability, not accusation. Instead of, "You always," try, "I feel." 2. Listen to understand, not to win. Pause. Breathe. Hear their heart, not just their words. 3. Acknowledge their pain, even if you disagree with their perspective. Validation is not agreement, it is compassion. 4. Apologize with sincerity, not defensiveness. An apology is not about blame. It is about healing. 5. Choose connection over pride. Be the first to reach out. Not because you were wrong, but because the relationship matters. 6. Make communication a daily habit, not a crisis-only event. Talk, share, check in emotionally. 7. Create emotional safety. Make your marriage a place where honesty does not lead to punishment. A final word to couples who have lost their voice. If you are in a season where silence has settled between you and the person you love, hear this. It is not too late. The bridge may be cracked, but it is not collapsed. The connection may be strained, but it is not severed. The communication may be quiet, but it is not gone. Because the very fact that you care about this topic means the love is still there. Maybe buried under fear, hurt, pride, or exhaustion, but still alive. Marriage is not about avoiding conflict. It is about navigating conflict together. It is about learning, growing, and choosing each other even in the hardest moments. So speak, even if your voice shakes. Listen, even if your heart is tired. Humble yourself, even if pride resists. Apologize, even if you fear rejection. Forgive, even if the wound is fresh. Try again, even if the silence feels heavy. Because communication is not just a skill. It is a lifeline. And as long as two people are willing to talk, to listen, and to rebuild, there is nothing a marriage cannot overcome. Silence does not have to be the end. It can be the beginning of deeper intimacy, greater connection, and a love that has weathered storms and still stands.